Let's apply an external critical eye to business technology. What are the hidden costs of data centers? What about the dirty secret of AI and the investments in governance that are required? Technology isn't necessarily the panacea it's made out to be, and Paris Marx has applied their lens to several of these issues and joins me today. Welcome to the Business of Tech Lounge, the live version of the Business of Tech podcast. It's Wednesday, October 9th, 2024. And I'm Dave Sobel. We'll take questions and comments throughout the show, so make sure to put them in chat. If you have a question, we will happily respond to it. Now, I want to thank Sales Builder, our Patreon sponsor, whose support makes this show possible. Focus on your IT sales workflow with the power of automation and visit them at salesbuilder.com. That's BUILDR.com. Reminder, I am watching that chat and we'll take questions as we go. Now, Paris Marx is a technology writer who's written frequently in, among others, Wired, NBC News, and Business Insider, and speaks internationally on the future of transportation. They're also a PhD student at the University of Auckland and the host of the critical technology podcast, Tech Won't Save Us. Paris, welcome to the show.
Hello, great to join you.
I'm super excited for this conversation, and for my listeners, I'm actually a bit of fan of Paris's in both as a reader and listener to the podcast. And I'm going to start with you've actually got a new series, Data Vampires, and you're focused on the idea of the hyperscalers. Now, it was interesting to me because one of the basic ideas of cloud computing is that for most organizations, operating the core components of IT infrastructure is difficult to do, particularly with the high level of uptimes and now with the increasing level of security needs. Email is the classic example, right? In the aughts, Microsoft sold a lot of on-prem servers to run email, calendaring, file sharing, all that kind of stuff, the basic operations. But as we rolled through the 2010s, we moved those offerings into the cloud. And in particular, small businesses gained a lot of capabilities here. But as you've been looking at the hypercenter and the data center investment, you've got a premise around data centers and some specific concerns. Give me a little insight into where your head's at on data centers.
Absolutely. And, my concern is largely with the hyperscale data centers, right? Because of the scale that they reach and the amount of, resources, water, things like that are necessary in order to power these things. But as you're saying, there's also this other dimension of it too, right? I understand the convenience aspect that they offer, right? When you put all these things on the cloud or when you're taking advantage of servers that are run by Amazon, Microsoft, Google, these major providers, if that's not your core competency of your business, that makes it a lot easier just to focus on the things that you want to be focusing on. So I completely understand that dimension of it, right? But then when we flip to the other side of it, we can see that this gives these companies an immense amount of power over the larger economy, over all the businesses who use these sorts of things. And I think that is part of where my other concern comes in, right? There's the environmental piece of it, which certainly we can talk about a bit more if you want. But then on the other hand, there's this, this kind of power that these major companies have gained over the larger economy that, prompts these discussions about antitrust and monopoly and competition that we've been having these past few years. And I really see the data center, the hyperscale data center in particular, as, kind of a great illustration of how that works and a really key node in, that larger discussion.
So I would agree with you. And I think one of the interesting things about this is the classic model should be, theoretically, right, that we build a capitalist playing ground. We let everybody fight it all out. And I always like to say, and regulation is the guardrails to keep things from going off. My example that I use all the time is that, look, if we were to, you and I go into business and we're going to build a chemical treatment plant, the easiest way to get rid of our waste is to put our plant by a river and dump it all in the river, right? That's by far the most economical way to do it. It's costly.
And there's been plenty of that over the years, right?
Yeah. Right, exactly. Yeah. And so from a capitalist perspective, it's the way to do it. And thus society says, hey, we like, fish that don't have three eyes. And so we're going to put guardrails on there. And thus politics becomes the discussion of, what is clean water? Like we'll get into that. It's a dirty word. What I'm interested in understanding is like, give me a little bit of the insight into your analysis framework of what you're thinking about those costs, because the argument that is made for the plus side of the economy is, hey, we're enabling a lot of business.
Mhm.
Right? In our world, lots of small businesses are now able to do a whole bunch of stuff they couldn't do before. They can sell, they can grow their business. We've grown the economy over time. What are we measuring and balancing off that, and kind of what is that analysis framework that you're using to ask those questions?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And just to pick up on what you were saying, when you look at, I think the obvious example, at least when you're thinking about like, the tech industry more broadly, is that you have the kind of origins of cloud computing in about 2006 with Amazon Web Services, and that foundation obviously also, helped by the iPhones and kind of the growth of the smartphones starting in 2008, 2009, and then into the early 2010s. By the time we reach that period, we have like this explosion of startups being created and stuff like that, prompted by the smartphones release and the way that cloud computing enables that, right? Because all of a sudden you have these companies that are just starting up using Amazon Web Services or, the other alternatives, and then being able to, kind of take off as a result of that. Some of them died, of course, but some of them grew quite large. But then when we think about the cost of it, if we look back at that period, that was still early days, right? There were a ton of concerns that came from the fact that, okay, we had some companies building these bigger data centers, but it wasn't this kind of dominant mode of for like how computation happens and how all these businesses are using these sorts of things. But as we see that growth of that, particularly over the past 5 years or so, where we see Amazon, Microsoft, and Google in particular, because they are the dominant players in this market, really start to build out these increasingly large hyperscale data centers, more and more of them in different parts, not just of the United States, but around the world. What I have noticed and what I have been noticing for quite some time was that, in places like Northern Virginia or like Ireland, where already there were a lot of these being built, we were already hearing about the concerns in the community kind of, pre-pandemic and some years before that in particular, right? But now, as we have seen this push to build out more and more of these data centers in more and more communities around the world, those concerns that were, being expressed by those communities where there were already a lot of data centers being built a few years ago are now being heard in so many more parts of the world, right? Because when these massive hyperscale data centers move in, because they are such large facilities, because there are tens of thousands of servers under the roof here, they make a lot of demands on the local energy grid and or on the local water system, right? In order to cool these facilities, but also in order to run all of the servers. And so, for example, in Ireland, 21% of all the electricity that the country uses now goes to data centers. And in the winter, they often have the issue Amber Alerts because they need to tell people like, can you reduce your energy consumption, or we're going to have rolling blackouts because of the amount of energy that these data centers are requiring and how much that has increased over the past number of years. And then in other places, say like Spain or Arizona, you have these concerns about water where you have these regions that are already suffering from droughts. And these major tech companies are moving in and saying, we want to build these massive hyperscale data centers here, taking advantage of the fact that some of these communities, are struggling economically and kind of want to accept any economic opportunities that come, that are offered to them. But then as a result, you have these constraints on the amount of water that people can access, or these questions and concerns about what that might mean. So that's one main piece of it. And one final thing I would add is that, when you have these massive energy demands that come of these data centers, especially as you have more and more of them being built. And, the numbers, when you look at them, Synergy Research has been following this. They've really exploded in the past number of years, where there's now over 1,000 hyperscale data centers. And that number is predicted to, continue expanding significantly in the coming years. But what you have you see it in communities in the United States, but also in Ireland and other parts of the world where, regions and governments and energy regulators and utilities and whatnot are bringing renewable energies online to try to displace the fossil fuels to address, try to meet the climate targets that we are collectively setting. But what they're finding is that as the renewables come online, the demand for power is increasing so significantly and so quickly that the fossil fuels have to stay online as well. And there was a story, I can't remember if it was in the Financial Times or Bloomberg last month, basically saying that the United States now is adding more fossil fuel infrastructure faster than it has been in a very long time. And those are clear concerns, right? Especially when we look at Hurricane Milton barreling toward Florida right now.
So, and the one that I've been looking at is of course they're talking about bringing 3 Mile Island back online.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I mean, literally. Now, there's a potential positive argument to that because, of course, Microsoft themselves is pouring a lot of money into making that happen, and there's an argument to be made that they're investing more into that. Now, I kind of want to get a little bit of like let's talk a little bit of solution because our audience is those implementers of technology that are building their businesses as part of being the ecosystem of that. It's my sense, this is kind of what capitalism does, is the answer here where we need to spend more time on regulation and discipline over guiding the market? Like how if you were prescriptive about that, again, what's your framework for thinking about the solutions here?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? What we've seen in a number of parts of the world are attempts to bring in regulations around the planning of data centers, right? Regulations that give communities a bit more say in the types of infrastructures that they want to be allowing there. If they're okay with the amount of energy demands or water demands that are being made. Again, the difficulty there being if you're going to an economically disadvantaged community, they might just have to accept anyway, especially if they're really concerned about trying to get some more economic opportunity or whatnot. And then of course we've seen in some places like Ireland and Singapore temporary moratoriums on data center construction, or at least connections of data centers to the grid, because they could not keep up with the energy demands that these facilities were making. And I think I would make a larger point here too, right? Which connects to what you were saying, is that before the advent of cloud computing, certainly, we were using data centers, the amount of computation that we were using was growing. But once you have this major business that is underneath, that is under the control of, say, Amazon, Microsoft, or Google, these major these major tech companies, but also major cloud providers, it creates an incentive for them, because we know how business works. You need to have growth year on year. And especially in these cloud businesses, they throw off a lot of profits for these companies. Amazon in particular has really relied on the profits that have come from Amazon Web Services. And so it creates this incentive then to need to continually increase the amount of computation that we are collectively using as a society, regardless of whether that computation is actually providing more wide scale benefits to people, right? If it's actually, being used for use cases that are positive. And instead, I think what you see is that these companies are incentivized to try to increase the amount of computation that we all require, that the technical tools that we use require, regardless of whether, that works, because then they make more money in their cloud businesses. They can charge their clients more because they're using more computation in order to, do what they need to do. And I think that is, an incentive that is created for those companies that's not necessarily in the broader interest, but works for their business goals, right? And I think that there's a bit of a disconnect there when we think about the way forward, or how we should be thinking about these businesses and restructuring them, and whether it makes sense to have that general incentive when we can see the growing energy demands, water demands, the effects on climate targets and things like that are the result of that economic incentive there.
Well, it's interesting because there's been a rise in cloud computing cost management solutions, particularly for for mid-market, upper mid-market, but we're starting to see that much more even in small businesses. Those extra licenses that are still out there. There's my capitalist brain wants to continually say, like, well, there's opportunity here, right? Like we can actually make money off taking money away from the cloud providers and making sure that it keeps within our customers. And there's an interesting evolution that I know my listeners have been watching as we've evolved from resellers of technology to implementers of technology. We make a significantly more amount of money on the services than we do on, say, selling servers like we did in the aughts. So there's an opportunity here to push back. And what is interesting is that scale it's significant. For each individual business, you're trimming a little bit, but at scale, it becomes interesting. And by the way, we haven't even moved into AI, because the moment I layer AI onto this conversation, we supercharge the whole thing because of the tremendous compute power involved in there. And you recently wrote, I want to kind of dive into this a little bit, about the kind of the dirty secret about this. And to give you some of my insight, the other dirty secret of AI for businesses is that in order to be effective with it at all, you've got to invest in data management and data governance. Because if you throw a bunch of data at, say, Microsoft Copilot, you actually don't get particularly good results back. And if you read the fine print of implementation, it's about preparing the data. You argued against the idea of kind of robots taking over the job, suggesting that we should look at transforming it. I would agree with that. Where do you think kind of that space is to find the right balance? Like, what is the balance of effectiveness as you think about these coming changes?
Yeah, so I would say I definitely go back and forth on AI, what implementations it makes sense for, which it doesn't. I was speaking to Sasha Lucioni recently, who is the climate lead at Hugging Face, and she was essentially describing, the difference between these more traditional, AI systems that we were using versus generative AI, and basically saying that in some cases, if you're thinking about doing a Google search and then replacing it with, a conversation with ChatGPT, but getting a similar result out of that, you're using about 30 times more energy just to get the same answer to the query, right? And does it make sense to have those implementations in those places? And I think going back to what I was saying about, the incentive to increase the amount of computation that we're using, part of the reason that we have this generative AI that, there's been all the hype about for the past almost 2 years now, is precisely because these major cloud companies were able to have this centralized computation that is necessary to train the models and then create the implementations, the use cases for the types of tools that OpenAI or Google, for example, are putting out. And without that, you could still do some form of generative AI, but it would need to be much more tailored, right? Not these kind of general foundation models that companies like OpenAI have been creating and have been promoting as the future, and also a potential pathway to artificial general intelligence and all this kind of stuff, which I think is pretty ridiculous. But yeah. But it's like, the reason that happens, and the reason that is the type of generative AI or AI implementations in general that are being pursued by the companies is, because of the centralized infrastructures that they've created, and also the incentives that have come along as a part of that. And then the other piece, just to get to what you were saying about jobs, is I'm always very skeptical when we talk about AI replacing jobs. And part of that comes out of, yes, we have seen technologies in the past be used to transform the way that work is done. That doesn't always mean that jobs are replaced, but that jobs can be kind of changed, like how they actually work, the type of works that the type of work that the workers are doing. It's often de-skilling the work, so the worker is still there, but they don't require the skill that they used to do the thing. And then, as a result, management can reduce their wages or something like that. But for me, I guess the example that I think back to is in the mid 2010s, when the tech industry was telling us that robots were coming for our jobs, that AI was going to transform everything in the course of a few years, and up to like half of all jobs were going to be eliminated or significantly changed. And then that didn't really happen. But what we did see is companies like, say, Uber or Amazon roll out algorithmic management that gave them more power over their workers. And so when I see, generative AI coming along and a lot of these similar promises or kind of scare tactics being used, I'm very skeptical that they're actually going to end up replacing jobs. But I think that in some sectors, they will try to change the way that work is being done. And that won't necessarily be, on the one hand, better for the workers who do that work. But also, I'm skeptical that it's better for the broader society. Because I think if we look at the impacts of the gig economy today, looking back at it, we can see that, okay, it made it more convenient to hail a ride or whatever. But there were a lot of people who became much more precarious as a result of that transformation. And because of, the legal campaign that Uber has, has engaged in since then, we've seen in a number of jurisdictions, it's become easier for companies to classify their workers as contractors instead of employees. And I'm concerned about the broader impacts of that as well, right? If we're thinking about like a fair economy and the cost of living crises that we've been experiencing and all those sorts of things, that doesn't seem like the right way to address those broader social problems.
So I'm with you, by the way, and I want to say, like, particularly as we're talking about this for the first time, like, I'm skeptical of the replacement theory as well.
Yeah.
I'm actually much more interested in the idea of augmenting people and making them better at their jobs than I am about like replacing them. Particularly because my own experiences and the data that I'm looking at shows that the best investments are when we're using it to augment capabilities and make something better. Now, I want to get your take on this because I feel like shaking our fists at the cloud when I think about Uber or large companies, like I'm kind of being angry at them for being good at the things they're designed to be good at. A business is designed to generate profit for its shareholders and to create economic stability. I'll use Scott Galloway's phrasing for this, for the people that are involved with that. I would argue that it is society's job to protect those bits. But we talk about it in terms of pushing back on the companies. And so how do you reconcile that in terms of where we should be spending our focus, both as kind of business leaders in the way we're spending our money, but also then potentially where we're spending our larger human capital?
Yeah, it's an important question, right? And I agree. I think that the anger toward the businesses in these major companies comes out of the fact that they are emblematic of these particular ways of running a business, treating workers a certain way, what have you. And you kind of need to like put the spotlight on that so that people recognize what's actually happening there. And then you can talk about the solution to it, right? And of course, as you say, just getting angry at Uber will not change the fact that they treat their workers in a particular way. There's a really interesting interview that Dara Khosrowshahi gave a few years ago where he basically said, like, we live in capitalism, not laborism. So this is what I have to do, right? And it was like, fair enough. Like, and to me, that says, right, so the solution to this is not to say, oh, Uber, you should do better. It's to say, governments, why are you not regulating this properly? And why are you allowing yourselves to be captured by Uber in this way? To rewrite labor rules so that Uber can do what it wants to its workers, instead of saying, no, your workers should be employees, and that should be a standard across the sector, instead of pushing Uber itself to do that while not pushing Lyft to do the same or something, right? Because I feel like the concerns that I hear sometimes, if you're talking about wages or something like that, even from small business, is that like, if I raise my wages, that makes me anti-competitive with other people who are operating in the sector. But if you kind of increase the floor for everybody, if you put a particular regulation in place, then at least everyone is on the same playing field, right? And I'm sure there will still be people who won't like certain regulations. That's life. That's different people have different views on these things. But at least then, everyone needs to operate from the same standard. And I think part of what has concerned me over the past, say, 15 years is that a lot of the hype around the tech industry, and particularly these large tech companies, has allowed them to claim that they are kind of separate or distinct from the traditional businesses in the sectors where they operate, and that they should be treated different from a regulatory perspective, where their businesses can operate in a way that, say, traditional businesses maybe couldn't necessarily operate, or they could get away with things that other businesses wouldn't be able to get away with. And for me, I just kind of want to see that playing field leveled. Maybe I want to see the levels of the standards raised as well, just broadly. But I think that is where some of my concern comes in. So like when I see, discussion around, raising minimum wages or around antitrust for these large tech companies, I don't think that always goes far enough necessarily, but I think that those are welcome conversations to try to say, okay, you companies that have really grown enormously over the past 15 years, now you need to start to play by the rules that everyone else plays by, because part of the reason you've been able to grow so large over that time is because the attention of regulators was not really on these particular companies, but now that they've become so big, that is obviously what has happened there. And I think and I'm sure, people in your sector would recognize this as well, but when these major companies have as much power as they have, it allows them to squeeze kind of everybody else, right? And that doesn't work out for anybody, I don't think.
Well, I'd agree with that, but but there's the counter argument, and I kind of want to get your insight into this is that regulation actually does favor the large companies in that because they've got armies of lawyers, right? They are well funded, they are able to influence the political system, and in particular, like if we look at, I'm going to pull out GDPR in Europe, right?
Yep.
As a privacy framework, and listeners know that I've long since said the U.S. should have something. Nothing is a problem, but the Europeans have something, and it has tended to favor larger companies that are able to navigate it at the expense of the smaller companies, right? And then you have we have very simple examples, like in Philadelphia, a bridge collapses, and the governor essentially says, "Well, we're going to kind of look the other way on regulation and stuff," and then they get it repaired in 2 weeks. And there's an argument to be made of, wow, things get done when we move back. That's the classic argument on this, both that it favors the large and it favors, the lack of regulation favors speed. How do you reconcile that, particularly for an audience of people that are the smaller companies that are not able to deal with that infrastructure?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on both points, right? And this is part of the difficulty, right? Because if you have a company that is as powerful as, say, a Google or a Microsoft, they have the lobbying power to just go nuts and make sure that the regulations that get written are ones that favor them. I remember there was this story in Time magazine last year about how you might remember, but after kind of the Chat GPT hype started, Sam Altman went on this kind of world tour where he was talking to regulators and governments around the world. And the story came out in Time magazine last January, I believe it was January of 2023, to be clear, saying that the regulators, or maybe it was, I don't know. It was January of some year. Maybe it was early this year. Anyway, but so they published this story basically saying that when Sam Altman was in Europe, he spoke to the regulators who were designing the new AI regulations there. And he specifically requested a carve out for the types of work that OpenAI was doing. And then when these regulations were presented, what do you know? That carve out was there, right?
There, right?
Yeah, and so I completely agree with you, right? I think that regulations are needed to address these problems, but the problem that we have is that our governments can be so easily captured by these major companies, which on the one hand speaks to why we need to address the amount of power that they've built up, but on the other hand, the issues that have built up in government over quite a number of years. And of course, this isn't just in the United States. I was just talking about Europe, for example, but many other governments where there has not been, I think, the kind of pressure from the other side of things in order to say, not everything should favor these massive tech companies, that have certainly delivered a lot of economic advantage to the American economy, of course. But, that constrains other businesses, smaller businesses potentially, and also has, which is, I think, the discussion that we're increasingly having, a number of negative impacts on the society more broadly that maybe we should have been paying a bit more attention to as these companies were growing, and that now we're trying to address after the fact, which makes it harder to do, right? And just on your other piece about, the regulations potentially slowing things down and holding things back, I feel like this is like a general problem in North America, and I don't have a specific solution to say, like, this is what we need to do to address it. But I think that just in general, like, you look at when we try to build infrastructure, whether it is, bridges or, say, mass transportation, you see when, like, say in New York, they try to build subway lines and it costs just crazy amounts of money, and takes forever. Like, anytime that the government tries to do these projects, it seems to have this really difficult time with it. Meanwhile, you can look at, say, and Europe is not perfect, but Europe seems to get things done at lower budgets and more quickly than we do. Paris, for example, is in the process of this massive build out of its metro system. And it's like, I can't even imagine something like that happening in North America, right? And then, of course, you look at Japan, another kind of peer country, high income country like ours. And they, are also able to build infrastructure like say if a bridge is broken, they can replace a bridge quite easily, and it doesn't take nearly the amount of time that it takes
Right.
here. So I don't have
Yeah.
like a particular solution there, but it feels like something is broken in how our governments work in North America
Yeah.
specifically to try to do this. And unfortunately, I don't have a fix, but I agree with
Well,
you with the
at least
problem.
we're talking about it. And by the way,
Yeah,
listeners, if you got any last questions as we get into the last topic or so, I'm definitely want to throw them up. So, Paris, I want to shift gears a little bit because
sure.
I wanted to ask you kind of about something that is implied a little bit in what we've been talking about. I think I
Mhm.
want to get specific about it. You've talked about a lot about Google, about Amazon, about Uber. It's my observation that you've a little bit less focused on Microsoft. And I kind of wanted to ask a little bit why, and the reason, to give you some perspective. I know our listeners think about this all the time. Microsoft is a very key player in the vast majority of small and mid-sized organizations. Everybody, there's a reason why everybody runs Office, and the majority of people are on something like Microsoft 365. Give me a little bit of your perspective on Microsoft, and either like, are they different in your mind? Are they fit in another category? How do they fall in this spectrum?
I feel like they've just been so like normalized, like in the sense of
Okay.
what their businesses are and how dominant they are. And I think the other piece of it as well is that when we're thinking about, say, the harms that have arisen as a result of these businesses that have been developed over the past, say, couple of decades, if you think about Amazon's growth or Google's search engine or even Apple's App Store, which, is kind of a post 2009, 2010 sort of a thing, like these are more novel developments in what has happened. Whereas with Microsoft in particular, we had an antitrust case with Microsoft in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Mhm.
So we've already kind of been over that. And, they got through it rather unscathed, in part because of the George W. Bush administration coming in and, signing a pretty favorable deal with them so that they wouldn't be broken into two separate companies. And then, of course, Bill Gates kind of rehabilitating his image through philanthropy and these sorts of things. So it has been really interesting to me because Microsoft is one of the most valuable companies in the world, but just generally there has not been the same degree of scrutiny on their business practices as there has been with these other major large tech companies. And again, I think part of it is just because what they do is so normal, but also not as like consumer facing or not as clearly
Yeah.
harmful to consumers as it is with some of these other companies. And I feel like that is sort of changing right now, especially seeing what they've been doing with AI and open AI in particular, and of course the broader investments in the generative AI kind of startup field where investigators have started looking into whether some of these deals are kind of anti-competitive, even though Microsoft is not outright buying the companies themselves, but finding a
Mhm.
way to invest in the companies and get access to their technology and have a certain degree of say over how they operate, and of course make them reliant on the Microsoft Azure platform, without actually buying them outright, which has been really successful for them in the case of OpenAI in particular. So I think that is part of the reason for it. And of course, my focus is mainly because there are certain companies that I have been focused on over my kind of career of doing this, and Amazon and Uber are two of the key ones. And I've been more interested in Apple from like I guess a consumer standpoint. I
Mhm.
use Apple devices and things like that. And so that's probably part of the reason that my focuses are on certain companies over others. But I do think that it's reflective of kind of the larger approach that, say, tech media or even researchers have been looking at, where Microsoft is kind of like the known quantity. Like it does some bad stuff that you don't necessarily like, but it's not as it feels not as outrageous as what some of these other companies are doing, maybe because what they're doing feels a bit more novel, whereas Office and Word and things like that have been around for a long time. And sure, Microsoft has transformed how those businesses work, especially over the past decade or so. But it's still like, okay, we all rely on Windows. We don't use Internet
Right.
Explorer or Edge anymore. We have some new browsers, and Microsoft's luckily not forcing us into those any longer. But yeah, I think that would be like my explanation of why there's less of a focus on Microsoft.
I'll completely buy into that, and I will sort of wrap us up by also observing that they went through the scrutiny, had penalties, and many of the internet companies we just talked about came because of that
Yeah.
scrutiny and because of that. So for those of the, I know again, my small business audience, and I feel this pain too, is when we think about regulation maybe being a bad thing, in some cases, it has been a real unlock for new technologies. And I think it's important for us to remember that.
Yeah, and that's part of the discussion now too, right? Like as there's these antitrust cases against, say, Google and Amazon and these other ones, part of the discussion is, does this make it so that they are not, acquiring their potential competitors, and in the next 5 years or something, we will have companies that are properly competing with them in a way that wouldn't have been possible because of their market dominance at the moment. We'll have to wait and see what happens there.
Right.
But certainly that's one of the things people are discussing at the moment.
Well, Paris, I could do this all day, so I'm going to be respectful of your time. That new series on the data vampires, how can people get access to that?
Absolutely. It's just a special series from my podcast, Tech Won't Save Us. So any podcast platform where, people listen to podcasts, they can find it. It's pretty simple. Just look up Tech Won't Save Us, and the episodes of that will be coming out every Monday for the rest of October.
Well, cool. Paris, thanks for joining me today. This has been fascinating.
Absolutely. It's been really fun. Thanks so much.
Well, I want to preview what's coming up this weekend. Colin Graves specializes in helping organizations build robust data capabilities, from establishing the right data infrastructure and governance to operationalizing data-driven decision-making. He discussed with me the importance of laying a solid foundation before pursuing advanced analytics or those AI initiatives, and he highlights the potential for natural language querying to revolutionize self-service analytics. Let's get a preview of that interview dropping this weekend.
There's three primary phases. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. A lot of folks come to you and just say, well, if I just program that continues to deliver value. So we have three core phases of our implementation, or I guess our project lifecycle. The first is implement, and that's sort of what you alluded to. We're assessing where you are. We're identifying the business value or the business problem that needs to be initially solved with data. Everybody kind of understands where they want the last domino to fall. It's complete utopia. Everything's automated. My data is super clean and trustworthy, and everyone raves about it. They don't really understand the first domino to flick over to cause that chain reaction to happen. And so we're standing up typically minimalist data infrastructure at first. We don't try and overbuild because, let's face it, we're in the cloud. The cloud is very flexible. It's very nimble. If somebody wants to eventually have a Formula One car, that's great. Maybe they can start with a scooter and build that muscle memory from there, get through that change management process. So
Patreon supporters already have this. If you want to listen now, it'll drop on the weekend on both YouTube and the podcast feed. If you're interested, I really do encourage you to listen. Colin had some real thoughts on the way to deploy data governance. Visit patreon.com/MSP Radio to sign up now. And let's thank Sales Builder, our Patreon sponsor, whose support makes the show possible. Focus on your IT sales workflow with the power of automation, and visit them at salesbuilder.com. That's BUILDR.com. And vendors, you too can get your name mentioned on the live show. It's a simple monthly subscription. Visit patreon.com/MSP Radio to learn more. And listeners, the number one thing you can do to support the show, like, share, and follow on your favorite platforms, or support directly on Patreon with our Give What You Want model. You set what you think the content is worth, and you get access to videos early. If you've got a question and are listening to the recording, send it in at question@mspradio.com. Thanks for joining me for the Business of Tech Lounge, and I will see you next time.